we're looking at Peter's list of, I think of them as character qualities that grow our likeness to Jesus over time with persistence. Now, we talked about more than half of these character qualities, and we're getting ready to talk about the last couple, 2 or 3. But quick review, you have to go to 2 Peter chapter 1, beginning in verse 5 for the entire list. And if you're just jumping in right now, you want to go back and start with verse 1 and see what Peter writes in these first 4 verses that set up the context, because verse 5 begins, for this very reason. Well, what is the very reason? Real quickly, it's because of what God has already done in our lives, that we have His divine power that makes it possible. It's given us everything we need, according to verse 3, for a godly life through our knowledge of Him who called us by His own glory and goodness. Through these, He has given us His very great and precious promises, so that through them you may participate in the divine nature, having escaped the corruption in the world caused by evil desires. For this very reason, in other words, because of that, because of how God has restored relationship with us and given us status in His heart and affections, we have now a status with God that we didn't have before, and it isn't because of what we've done. It's because the only sense in which it is because of what we've done is that it's because we have responded to it. But He did everything short of that to give us everything we need for a godly life. Now, here's what a godly life looks like, beginning in verse 5. Make every effort, he writes, to add to your faith goodness, and to goodness knowledge, and to knowledge self-control, and to self-control perseverance, and to perseverance godliness. And we've talked about all of those characteristics. Now in verse 7, and to godliness add mutual affection, and to mutual affection love. Okay. We talked about what godliness is. Godliness is me or you. It's any person conforming our thinking, our behaving, our feeling as best we can to God's design. It shows up in what we say and what we do. It shows up in our motives, which are very hard for anyone else to detect. But I think a thoughtful life requires every human to evaluate their own motives, okay? So godliness is next, cleanliness is next to godliness, right? Which is not in the Bible, and it depends on your standard of cleanliness. Well, we talked about that, and he says, to godliness, what do we add? Mutual affection. Now, this is important on lots of different levels. The Pharisees of the New Testament believed that they were engaging in a godly life, but they had narrowed the scope of godliness to this one thing: obeying the law. And really, the truth is, there were 360 some different laws that the Pharisees believed a godly person was required to obey. And they, honestly, there are things I don't ever want to be like in terms of the Pharisees, but their attention to meticulous detail of obedience is on some levels admirable. But here's the problem. They gave away this other thing in favor of godliness. What they thought of was godliness. Their strict adherence to the law and its codes. That for them was the entire definition of godliness. Well, I hope that you can see the New Testament makes, and in fact, very much of the Old Testament trumpets a message that obedience, strict obedience to the law, may not be the whole, in fact, is not the entirety of godliness, of choosing to live within God's design. God even said through a prophet, "Your sacrifices are a stench in my nostrils." But they've been commanded to make sacrifice. Well, okay. There's a whole bunch more to that, and I'm not going to go there. Where I am going to try and go is with the idea that if you don't connect godliness, conforming your life to God's design, if you don't add to that mutual affection, I think what you wind up with is what the Pharisees demonstrated: religious pride. They believed they were better. I don't think they had exceedingly high levels of mutual affection. They certainly didn't have high levels of mutual affection toward anybody who didn't buy into their concept of what life was about. They hated Jesus. Okay, there's the disconnect. Jesus was the embodiment of godliness. If you want the answer to the question, so what does a godly life look like? What does godliness look like? You read the biographies of Jesus. Jesus' life was a life of godliness. Now, Peter writes, "To your godliness add mutual affection." Mutual affection is it's a little bit of a fuzzy term, is it not? I think brotherly kindness in other translations fits here. But the point of mutual affection is two things: mutuality and affection. Mutual affection is quite different than just plain affection. You remember, it may not happen to you, but it sure happened to me along about junior high school when, there's something in a boy that kind of awakens to the concept that girls are kind of pretty. And guys like me, we would get Twitter-pated with these pretty girls. And we had affection, well, as best, an 8th grade boy can understand affection, which probably is attraction. And then we would do things like, passing a note or asking them to go get a malt after school, stuff like that. Okay. Well, so you have this affection, you show this affection, and the girl goes, "Nah." Well, that's a stake to the heart. I mean, that's a stab to the deepest. Well, if affection is not mutual, I don't say it's wasted, but it's very hard to stay motivated to keep giving affection when you receive no affection back. In my marriage counseling, this, I would say, is one of the top issues when one or the other of the spouse, and in some cases both spouses, feel very strongly that they're doing all the work and their spouse is doing nothing, that they're showing all kinds of affection, they're getting no positive feedback. And I can understand how that would happen. And part of it is me giving affection has everything to do with what I think affection is. You receiving it has everything to do with what you think affection is. And if we don't value or define affection in the same way, it can do this. One big thing is love languages. The 5 love languages is maybe one of the most useful, easy to understand, easy to read books, easy to think your way through of almost any of the human relations principles that I've ever learned and then taught. When there are 5 basic love languages, and I've ripped this off from Dr. Gary Chapman because he wants me to. He wrote the book and he wants the idea promoted. So let's take a look at it. There is, but the first one I'll reference is physical touch. Then there are words of affirmation. Then there are acts of service, and then quality time. And then, giving and receiving gifts. These 5 things. Now, I'm just going to use 2 of them as an example. What if one spouse's primary love language is physical touch? And here's how, one of the ways you know what your love language is, your primary, is when you experience this, you feel always, virtually automatically, you feel that you are loved. People with the primary love language of physical touch feel that when they are physically touched. Sometimes for men, it's easy to mistake that as your love language for the idea that most men, especially before they get into their 50s and 60s, they have this big felt need for sex. And physical touch, this love language, can be very non-sexual. And a big part of it is non-sexual. Okay, so his or her, this one spouse, feels that and they don't even know it yet, but their strongest primary way that they feel love is by physical touch. And so that's what they do for their spouse. A lot of touches, a lot of hugs, a lot of tender, even quick touches. But their spouse's primary love language is acts of service. And so they're doing acts of service all the time. And it makes it hard for the one who has this physical touch leveling, because they got to chase them down behind the vacuum and in front of the dishes and all of the things that acts of service do. And they neither one feel that their love language is being spoken to them, that their need to be loved and feel loved is being addressed. Why? Well, it starts out as 2 languages that don't connect, right? 2 kinds of expression, 2 ways of expressing affection that don't connect. And eventually they quit trying and they become convinced that the other really doesn't love them, or else they would show it. All right. Mutual affection in a marriage is one of the 2 things that hold a marriage together most importantly. The first thing I would say is commitment. I know of, and I'm reasonably sure you do too, people who stayed married for 50 years, but they really didn't like each other for about the last, 30 of the years, because they stay together because of commitment. The other is affection. Affection is one of the strongest motivating powers in our lives. Those we feel affection for, we will go far out of our way to demonstrate our commitment, to follow up on our commitment. But as our level of affection begins to fall, then this heightened commitment has to take over, and it can be sustained for a very long time. I'm just saying, for most people, and this is especially true in my experience, I'd say in the last 20 years in a marriage, when the affection drops, the commitment often falls as well. And a lot of that is because that's what culture says. If I lose the feeling, baby, you've lost that loving feeling. Whoa, whoa, whoa. And it's gone, gone, gone. And then they're gone, gone, gone. Mutual affection. I got more to say about it. Can you believe that? I'll come back to it next time on Soul Care with Stevie Boy.